problem with the way that we do things as churches is that it's just like every other organization, and it's that we can get so used to things that we just come up with our own jargon. We use our own words that nobody else understands. It's like you walk into an engineering firm and they're all speaking some kind of gibberish because you have no idea what they're talking about. And we do the same thing as churches. Like, we use these words and like, what does that mean? Like, so if I say the word redeemed, you have a general, none of you like could spout off a definition to it, but for most of us, if I say the word redeemed, you've got a general sense of what it means, but if you had to explain it, you would be at a loss, at least to explain it quickly and simply. We talk about redemption. We talk about salvation. Salvation, that word, like saved, that's an incredibly important word. That's a part of who we are, that word saved. But I ask our writers and our teachers in our kids ministry not to use the word saved. Because I remember as a kid using the word saved, and I know, I got an idea about what it means, and I am saved. But if somebody says, what does that mean? Like, I would have a really hard time explaining that. So we ask the writers, and sometimes they slip up, and I fix it. But we say, we're not going to use words that the kids can't explain what they mean. And so when we get in here and we do the same kind of thing, and one time I was in the teen room, and it was one of the times I was just kind of helping in there. I wasn't teaching this semester. And I was in there, and I said something about the gospel. And one of the teens said, what does that mean? What's the word gospel mean? And so today what I want to focus on before we jump into Colossians 2 is that idea of the gospel, what that word means, because it's incredibly important. We talk about it a lot. We use it a lot. But if I were to ask you to explain the gospel simply, not just to talk for 5 minutes, but to explain it simply, what would you say? The gospel is this. The word gospel means good news, which isn't particularly helpful in what we're talking about. It's just good news. But the word gospel is the good news that I cannot be enough to stand before God and be acceptable before Him. But Jesus came and lived a life that I could not live on this place, dealing with the temptations that I deal with. He came and I failed, but He got a perfect score. The punishment for my sin is death. I have to die. And I deserve death. But Jesus, who did not deserve death, died. And because He died with no debt to pay, He has a life, a death to offer. And He says that if I believe that He's the only Son of God, that I realize that I cannot do this on my own, and I say to Him, please do this for me, He will. That is the gospel. I can't. He can. He will. That's the gospel. I think we're just going to have t-shirts made that just say, I can't, He can, He will. Probably He did, but we'll work on the design later. We talk about the gospel, and like we say the gospel a lot. We've got the gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. We've got these, and we use this word, and we use the word gospel, and it's supposed to be a huge part of who we are, but we can't even really say what it is. So I just want you to look at this and focus on this today. What is the gospel? The gospel is this: I can't, He can, He will. Now, we're looking at Colossians. And the church of Colossae is in a bad spot because they don't have anybody that can just answer their questions clearly. They weren't started by an apostle. They were started by a guy named Epaphroditus, who was in the area when Paul was there, was saved through the work of Paul, came back to Colossae, and probably went over in Laodicea and some other areas over there and started churches with that message. And the gospel was all they had. The gospel in the Old Testament. And for a lot of them, they were picking that up for the first time, and they were very confused. And so they don't know what to do, and they come to Paul. They send Epaphroditus to Paul in prison in Rome, and they say, we need you to straighten us out because we're just lost. There's 4 major heresies we're dealing with. We don't know who's right. We need your help. And Paul helps them get on track by telling them who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, and now he's going to start He's going to give them a frame of reference to use to help them understand not just what this faith is about, but how they should live and what they should believe. And the frame of reference, the lens, the pair of 3D glasses he gives them to look at everything that they deal with in what they believe and how they live is the gospel. And that's what he gives them today as we start in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 6. He says in verse 6, Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. So he says, the way that you live and the things you believe all have to start with the gospel. And everything you believe and everything you do from that point has to be looked at through that lens. So as you received Christ, that is the gospel, that I was not enough. I was not enough to save myself. I was not good enough on my own. I'd failed and failed and failed and failed, and the punishment for my sin is death. But Jesus was enough. And he said that if I will trust in him, then he will be enough on my behalf. That's how I received Christ Jesus. That's what Paul says. So I want you to think about this. I don't want you to get lost because y'all are like, okay, we punched our get out of hell free ticket. We're good to go with that. Now we need to know about the rest of the life. He says, no, you started with the gospel. The same way that you received this is the way that you walk for the rest of your life. The gospel is not just the entry point into our faith, but it is the frame of reference for every aspect of our faith. It's the thing that we look at to decide how to live and what to believe. As you received it, so walk in it. We want to be saved. We want to enter in that relationship with God. And then we want to go, even though we just said the whole reason that I got into this thing is because I do not have the ability to do it on my own. We want to then switch once the life starts to, I'm going to do everything on my own, which makes no sense. We took up the tile in our kitchen and we were putting down these boards, and the problem is the refrigerator. So we got to move the refrigerator. So I get my dolly. I've brought my dolly to church with me before and showed you my dolly. I love my dolly, but I've got my dolly set up and I'm going to move the refrigerator out and I'm going to pick it up. But I'm also lazy, so I don't want to unload the refrigerator. I just want to move it. So we work the refrigerator out, and this is a family affair. I just can't. So I'm moving it out and we get it out. And I've got to have y'all's help to get this thing tilted up. So it was not practical or efficient in any way. Like at one point I was standing against this with my feet up on the sink. It was crazy. We get this refrigerator up on the dolly. And what I really want to do at that point is say, everyone get out of my way now, please. So I'm there with the dolly and I've got it up, and my instinct is to say, everybody else leave, please, because I'm trying not to yell. And I want to do this by myself. The problem is, I am no more able to move the refrigerator now that it's up than I was to pick it up in the first place. But I want to. So I tried. It did not work. I dropped the refrigerator. We had to do it over again. We eventually got it done. The life that we are called to live is not a life we could enter into on our own, but it's a life that once we enter into it, we're like, I got it from here now, God. I'm going to try real hard, and I'm going to get it done. And Paul says to them, the reason that you're having trouble is because you have forgotten the way you got into this deal in the first place. You couldn't pick the refrigerator up. And if you couldn't pick it up, you certainly can't move it. The whole premise of the gospel is, the first step is, I can't. But then we get into the life and we're like, okay, I'm going to resist sin. I am going to resist sin. You know, that sin I couldn't resist in the first time. I'm going to resist it now. I'm going to exert faith now. I'm going to lead my family now. I wasn't enough before, but I can be enough now that I've gotten my ticket punched and I can go through this. Which is ridiculous, but it's exactly what we do, right? The number of people that come to me and say, I feel like I don't know, maybe I haven't, they don't say to me, I've lost my salvation, because they know that we don't believe that. So they come and say, like, maybe I was never saved in the first place. Like, why? Well, I just can't, and I can't, and I can't, and I feel, and I can't. Like, the problem is not that you did not receive the gospel. The problem is that you received it and thought you were done with it. And you're not leaning on the gospel every day, not just for how you enter into the relationship with God, but how you live the relationship with God. Paul says, as you received him, so walk in him. That my method for getting through every day is this: I can't, he can, he did. That's not just how I get to heaven. That's how I get through the day. That's how I be the husband I'm supposed to be. That's how I be the father I'm supposed to be. I feel like that's grammatically incorrect, but I can't figure out the right way to say it. That's how I'm supposed to do these things. That's how I'm able to do these things. If it's going to happen at all, it happens when I believe the gospel, not just for my eternal life, but for my life right here and right now. I can't, he can, he will, and has. Paul says the reason you're having trouble is because you started with the gospel and decided it was done. And you want to recognize that you can't enter on merit, but you want to succeed on merit. And that's not how this works. As you received him, so walk in him. And he gives this picture of a tree. Our lives is a tree. He said that you are supposed to be rooted in the gospel. That the thing that holds you into the ground, that thing that keeps you from falling over, the thing that keeps you from going anywhere is the gospel. That's the beginning point. I can't, he can, he has, keeps me in the ground. It keeps me stable. It keeps me going. But also the way that I grow, the way that I'm built up in my faith is through the gospel. I can't, he can, he will. And that requires me to behave differently. If I start with I can't, I have to do this thing very differently. Teaching through spiritual disciplines with the teenagers. And we're like, okay, this is how you study the Bible. This is how you read the Bible. This is how you pray. This is how you combine these two things. This is how you do a quiet time. And we get to the end of the 7 weeks and I'm saying, okay, I have taught you all these things. Are you doing them? No. We're just learning. Bro, we're not doing stuff. We're just learning. So why are you not doing your quiet time? Well, I'm just busy. I have a lot going on. I can't get things done. A person who lives the gospel and does not just receive the gospel, but lives the gospel, they don't say, I am too busy to spend time with God. They say, I am so busy, I must spend time with God, because the premise of my faith is I can't. I can't. If I'm that busy, then the first thing I have to do is spend time with God. Like, well, I don't really want to get around to it today. I want to do something else today. If my mindset is I can't, he can, he has, I live my life differently. I grow differently because I'm not growing under my power. I'm growing under his ability to do things. You are supposed to be rooted in the gospel. But the exercise of the gospel is also how you grow in your faith. And you say, I'm not growing. I feel the same as I did when I was saved 20 years ago. I'm no different. I don't understand what the problem is. I try and I try and I try and I try and I try. Nothing changes. The problem is that you have forgotten the gospel. You can't. He can. He will. And you have to go to him first. You start with him. Lord, I can't today. I need you to. I can't do this. I need you to. I can't with these kids. I'm struggling to be the husband I need to be. I'm struggling to be the wife I need to be. I'm struggling to be your ambassador in the workplace. I'm trying as hard as I can. It has to stop. And it has to become, I can't do this. And you know I can't do this. This is why you had to die for me, so I need you to do this. Paul says the reason you're having trouble is because you have forgotten the gospel. You want to be rooted in the gospel, but you also want to be built up, and you want to be established in the faith. He says that the gospel is the thing that will help you know whether something is heresy or not. We got 4 different heresies that they're dealing with there, and they don't know which one is true. What do we believe? And he says, if you will be established enough in the gospel that when somebody comes to you with something that changes your faith, you will look at that through the lens of the gospel. And you know, this is bonkers. This does not work. Because the premise of my faith is I can't, he can, he has. And now you're telling me I've got to keep these rules in order to maintain my salvation? You're telling me I've got to have this outpatient surgery in order to maintain my salvation? You're telling me I've got to do whatever it is to keep my salvation? Or I've got to do whatever it is to reach that next spiritual level? No. That doesn't work. Because I start with I can't. And if it depends on me, it's not happening. So that can't be true. And Paul says to them, if you will get the gospel, you will live the gospel, you will look at your faith through the frame of the gospel, then you will wind up where you need to be. And the way that you know if you're rooted in the gospel, if you're living out the gospel and not just using it for salvation, the way that you know that is that you will abound in thanksgiving. Because, Brother Roger, if I start every day with I can't and it gets done anyway, you know what that means? Somebody else did it. Somebody else did it. If I start every day with, Lord, I can't, you can, please do, then when it gets done, it's clear that He is the one that's moving. He is the one that's acting. He is the one that's working. And it changes my perspective on everything. You struggling with gratitude? You're not starting with the gospel. You're struggling to have a good attitude throughout the day, you're not starting with the gospel. Because when you start with the gospel, every time there's a success, every time there's anything that happens, you see God moving. And when it's all about you and what you can accomplish, every time you see something good happen, it's about you. But if you will start with the gospel, you will abound in thanksgiving. Because how could you not? You want to know how to live a life that honors Jesus, a life that you're intended to live? It all goes back to, I can't, He can, He has. And if you will do that, then you will move forward, you will grow in your faith, you will understand what is true and what is not true, and you will live a life that abounds with thanksgiving, because when you start with I can't and it happens anyway, you see the work of God in your life in a way that you don't see it whenever you're doing everything yourself. He says, okay, now we start with how we live is the gospel. But now let's go on to these problems that you're having. The answer is the same. I used to watch The West Wing. Anybody watched The West Wing a long time ago, back in the long ago days? And I would watch this, and I remember towards the end of the show, they were having another election. Alan Alda was a Republican, and he was running, and they would make fun of him because every time they asked him a question, they would say, what's your answer to this problem in society? What's your answer? And he would say, tax cuts. Every time, that was his answer. And finally, they asked him some kind of question about abortion or something, and they said, what are you going to say, tax cuts? And he said, yeah, tax cuts. The answer to every problem from that perspective was tax cuts. And whenever Paul answers questions about what's the problem, what's the solution to the problem? What does he say? Every time. The solution to what you believe, the solution to who you are, the solution to understanding pure doctrine. What's the answer? Not tax cuts. Gospel. It probably wouldn't hurt, but the gospel is the answer to every question. You want to know how to live? You want to know what to believe? He says this in verse 8. He says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human tradition, according to the elements of the spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. He said people are going to come at you with logical, plausible arguments, saying, well, but you think about it this way. You got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you build this little tower, and this is how it works out, and this is who you're supposed to be, and you wear the special underwear and do all the things, and it all makes logical sense. Those are Mormons that do that. It all makes, sorry, not everybody's in on that joke. It all makes logical sense. And what Paul says is don't let people pull you in with things that make sense to you but don't fit within the gospel. Don't let people pull you in with tradition. Don't let people pull you in with, well, we've been doing it this way for 1,000 years, so it must be right. Don't let them pull you in. If it does not fit in the gospel, it don't work. Don't let anyone take you captive by philosophy, empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ, not according to the gospel. I can't, he can, he has. If it doesn't fit in that, if it changes that, it is wrong. And it doesn't matter how much sense it makes. It doesn't matter how long somebody's been doing it. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. Paul says all you've got to do is say, does this fit with the gospel? And if it doesn't, then leave it alone, because it's not what we're trying to do. Let no one take you captive. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to take you captive to get you to work in some system. For them, it was Gnosticism. Well, you got to ascribe to our political philosophy. You've got to ascribe to whatever it is that we're doing. You've got to get this special knowledge and agree with our craziness over here. And if you do that, then you get it. And you just got to add that onto the gospel. They would say, okay, you got to keep Jewish regulations. You got to keep the laws. You got to keep these rules. And if you do that, then you're going to get in. But that doesn't fit. That doesn't fit. So you got to honor these other spiritual beings. You've got to honor these guys, because if you don't do that, it's not going to work. They're going to get away. That does not work with the gospel. They would say you've got to deprive yourself. If you deprive yourself of any pleasure because your flesh is evil and you punish yourself enough, then that doesn't work with the gospel. It doesn't matter how much sense it makes to you. It doesn't matter how captivating they are in what they say. If it doesn't fit in the gospel, it's wrong. Let no one take you captive with anything that does not fit in the gospel. In verse 9, why would you do that? Why does this supersede everything else? Why is it that the gospel supersedes everything else that happens? Because in him, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. That Jesus is the physical form of God himself. He is not some diet God. He is not a super angel. He is not something that's on a level with somebody else and, he's right most of the time, but he just kind of outranks somebody else. No, he is God. All of everything that is God is in him. And he says, you can't, I can, I will. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks when he speaks. It does not matter what anybody else thinks. I'll tell the kids to do something they don't want to do. Like, go take care of this. Like, but, no, you don't understand how this works. I am the authority, and you are not. And you may have lots of good reasons why you don't want to do what I'm telling you to do, but it doesn't really matter, because I supersede you. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. He is the one in whom all of God, everything that God is, dwells in him physically. And we have been filled in him. That what's been done in us, the gospel, the work that's been done in us, was not done by the order of Jesus and he delegated some lackey to go take care of it. He did it himself. He's filled us with the gospel. He's rescued us himself. And he is the head of everybody else. So anybody else that comes along, they have to answer to him. So if he says it, it goes, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. Verse 11 says, in him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the flesh, the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of the flesh, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. This seems to come out of nowhere. Like, we're talking about elemental spirits, we're talking about the gospel, we're talking about these things, and then we start talking about circumcision. Where does this come from? It's kind of out of nowhere. The reason he's talking about this is because specifically one of the heresies they were facing is this idea that, yes, the gospel is true, but you have to finish the work of Jesus by keeping the Old Testament law. You have to be circumcised. And all the women were like, well, that's great for the men, but what are we supposed to do? Like, how does that work for us? So there's this whole argument about following the law and going through circumcision and doing these things. And Paul says everybody else is trying to tell you to add things to the gospel. And one of things they're saying is you have to be circumcised. You have to follow the law. You have to become a Jew to do that. But that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says you can't, I can, I have. And that leaves no room for the law. He says, look, people are telling you you've got to be circumcised to be under the old covenant, the old agreement between Moses and the people of Israel and Abraham. You've got to be circumcised to be under that. But what he says is that Jesus has given you what you need for that. Circumcision is the outward sign that you belong to the covenant. But you want to know something? A little boy is born and he's circumcised on the 8th day. Do you want to know he is still a Jew for that first 7 days, regardless of his circumcision or not? He is still a child of the covenant for that first 7 days. That circumcision does not make him a Jew. His parents made him Jews. His parents made him a Jew. The circumcision, all that does is it displays outwardly what has already happened inwardly. And Paul says that you don't need to follow that law because God has already given you an outward sign of what's going on inside. He says, you were circumcised by a circumcision made without hands. That the circumcision of the new covenant, the covenant of grace, the covenant that says, I can't, he can, he has, the sign of that is not circumcision. That he saves you on the inside and he gives you a circumcision that's made without hands. The sign of your relationship with him does not come through a physical act. He says he has put off the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. He says that baptism is our circumcision. What does baptism do? It is an outward display of an inward condition. The same as circumcision. The circumcision doesn't make you a Jew, but instead it tells everybody around, I guess if you're modest, it tells everybody around that you are a Jew. It just tells everybody else what's going on the inside by an outward sign. And baptism does the same thing. That baptism tells everybody else what's happened. It doesn't make you a child of God. It displays to everyone else that you are a child of God. Paul says other people are trying to add things onto this. They're trying to add, let's say they're adding baptism onto this. They're adding circumcision onto this. None of that fits with the gospel. And what Jesus has called us to do to display our faith is not cutting ourselves. It's not hurting ourselves. It's not denying ourselves from all these things, whether they're sinful or not. It's not wearing a certain kind of clothes. The outward sign that he has given us to show what has happened inside of us is baptism. And you don't need all the rest of that stuff. There's a couple of important points to make about this. First of all, again, circumcision doesn't make you a Jew. It just shows that you're a Jew under the covenant. Baptism does not make you right with God. Baptism changes nothing about what's going on inside you. Baptism only shows everyone else what has already happened inside you. But there's something else about this too. The reason that we're sticklers about baptism, the reason that we're serious about baptism is, first of all, because it is an outward display of an inward condition. And you say, well, I was baptized as an infant. But it wasn't, if you were baptized as an infant, that doesn't display anything to anybody about what has happened inside you. It only displays what your parents felt like doing. So you come to me and you say, I've been saved, but I was baptized when I was an infant, so I'm good to go. We're going to ask you to do that again. Why? Well, because nobody can do it but us. Because we're the only ones that have it right, so we got to fix it. No. Because according to the New Testament, according to Paul, according to Jesus, baptism is an outward display of what's happened inside of you. And if that didn't happen inside of you when you were baptized, then it was just getting wet. It's not doing anything for you. So we insist that you be baptized after salvation. We also insist on immersion, which is going under, dunking, going all the way under, coming all the way back up. Why do we insist on that? Why is a little sprinkle not enough? Because the picture we're displaying is the picture of the death and burial of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Because what has happened to me when I trusted him is that I died with him. I was buried with him. And I was raised to new life with him. And if the picture doesn't picture what it's picturing, it ain't a picture. You know what I mean? If it's not immersion where we actually display what's happening, then it's not baptism. So we're sticklers about those two things because of that we are called to make an outward sign of what has happened inside of us so that we display to everybody what's happened. You say, well, I've never been baptized. I've just been saved. I have a private faith. I don't need to tell everybody else. According to Jesus, you do. According to Paul, you do. That this is an act of obedience you take after salvation. And if you haven't done it, I'm not mad at you, but you're not right. This is a sign that we're supposed to display about what has happened inside of us. And Paul says that when you do this, you have to look at this through the frame of the gospel. What is it saying? What is it picturing? And what is it for? Based on the gospel. Verse 13, you who are dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all our trespasses. That God, what he has done, for those that say, well, it's not all done, the work is not all done, but that what Jesus himself has done is that we were dead, had no ability to save ourselves. Although I'm still walking around and talking, before I was saved, I might as well have been dead for all the good it did me. But Jesus, not me, because I can't. Jesus made me alive with him and forgave me. He forgave all of my trespasses, all of my sins. Not the sins up until the point that I accepted forgiveness, but all the sins before and all the sins after have been covered by Jesus. And this is what he did. He took the record of debt, the list of my sins, the list of punishments I deserve, and he set it aside. He took that list of my punishments and he nailed it to the cross. Now, why did he do this? Why does this matter? Because he was disarming the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Do you know what the word Satan means? It is not the devil's name. The word Satan means accuser. It means adversary. And his role in the throne room of God is to accuse everyone. That when you stand before God, he will stand beside you and list your sins. His goal is to hurt the Father as much as possible through us. He is the one that makes sure that God cannot get by just letting us off. That he accuses, and he is right. But what Jesus does when a believer stands before God, Satan accuses, and Jesus takes that list. He takes the list of charges, he takes the list of accusation, and he walks over to the cross, and he nails that list to the cross and said, it's paid for. All of it. He puts Satan to open shame and triumphs over him for those who are willing to believe. Why does this matter? Because they were being told, well, yeah, but this person might be able to get in the way. This person might be able to get in the way. Sure, you got to do that stuff for the gospel. What if Satan gets involved and he possesses you? Jesus has disarmed anyone that might stand against you. There is no record of debt for those who believe. There is nothing to accuse you of, regardless of the sins that you commit, because Jesus has paid for them all. I can't. He can. He has. Paul says, look, you are so scared and you're so worried because you don't know what to believe and you don't know what to do and you don't know what to land, but you have the answer to all your questions already. And that answer is the gospel. You can't. He can. He will. Maybe there's somebody here today that has never accepted that. That the premise of your faith that you was given when you were a kid, that you've grown up with your entire life, is that you have to be good enough. You have to try hard enough. If you'll just be as good as Grandma was, then you'll get in. You'll be fine. You have to do that. You have to keep the 10 Commandments. You have to go to church. You have to meet this list of rules. And if you will do that, then you'll be fine with God. That's not the Bible. That's not the gospel. The gospel is this: you can't. He can. And if you accept that you can't and He can, and you ask Him to, He will. And if you're still holding on to your own, this pride that says that you're going to take care of it yourself, let it go. Because it doesn't work. Maybe you've accepted this. You accepted this a long time ago. But as soon as you got in the door, you decided that this was no longer about the gospel and it's about you. And you spend all your time worried about how angry God is with you. You spend all your time worried about, is He going to take my salvation away after all? Is He going to make an exception and take that away from me because I know how bad I've been? I know how I fall short. I know what's going on. And you spend all this time afraid. You're forgetting the gospel. The whole premise of the gospel is that you can't, but He will and has. Rest in that. Rest in that. Yes, you are supposed to obey Jesus. Yes, there are things you're supposed to do and not do, but we do those as a response to what He has done and not to get Him to do them. We do that out of love for Him. And when we fail, we fail. But He knew the failure was coming, and He did it anyway. Rest in that. But then there are some of us that we accepted this a long time ago, and we lived in this for a long time, but we have been in this thing for so long that we have forgotten that we are not the ones that got ourselves here. And we're getting a little judgy. We get a little judgy towards those who are new to this. We get a little judgy to those who are still coming along. We've gotten enough strength. We've gotten enough stamina that we can go for a little ways, and we're dealing with different stuff. And we forget that we did not get ourselves there. And for you, you need to remember the gospel too. Because when you think, I've got enough speed up to do this thing on my own, that is the moment you're preparing to crash. You need to remember the gospel. You need to remember the gospel in your marriage. You enter into your marriage understanding that you are a sinner, you can't do this. And you need to turn that thing over to God. You need to turn that marriage over to Him. Because if you try to do this on your own, it's going to fail. You have to remember that you will fail in this marriage. And that if you're going to fail, they're going to fail too. And so that changes the way that you speak to them. It changes the way that you act towards them. It changes the way that you forgive them. Because when you both start out understanding that you're going to fail, you show each other grace because you want the same grace in return. The way that you deal with your children, understanding that they are little sinners. And Jesus' response was not to be angry with them at that, but to have His heart break over that and to rescue from them from that. And when they fail, you remember your own failure and extend them grace. Appropriately, with wisdom, you extend grace. The way that you work with people, and you work with this boss, and that boss is just hard to deal with. They're an awful person. They're lazy. You don't like them. A person who has forgotten the gospel just stays angry all the time. But a person who remembers the gospel understands that they are a sinner just like you. That Jesus died to rescue from all of that you hate about them. and that He has placed you in that place to be a display, not of what you can do, not of how good you are, not of how they can be like you, but the fact that He can do the same thing in them that He has done in you. Remember the gospel. Because the gospel is what got you to the point that you could look down on other people. The gospel is the thing that got you far enough along that you could look back and see other people that can't keep up. The gospel is the thing that got you to this point. Don't get cocky because He put you up somewhere. Remember the gospel. How do we live as a church? The gospel. How do we become to know Jesus? The gospel. How do we decide what to believe and how to practice and how we spend our money and how we're going to treat each other? The gospel. And if we will keep this idea that I can't, He can, He has in the forefront of our minds, the way that we treat each other, the way that we accomplish this mission, the way that we do things will change. Paul said, I don't need to write you a 2,000 page. I've got this systematic theology book that I tried to teach through. It wasn't very successful. Gene and Johnny made it through, and nobody else. We just didn't go that far. That was a different class that y'all went through. But we went through this book, and it's a 2,000 page systematic theology book to tell you what to believe and how to believe it and why to believe it. And when Paul wanted to help the Colossians understand what to believe and why to believe and how to believe it, he didn't give them a 2,000 page book. He gave them the gospel. And if you will embrace the same thing that He has offered to them for yourself, you'll be different. But only you can decide. Would you stand with me? Our Heavenly Father, I come before you right now, and I'm so grateful for the simplicity of our faith. And there are definitely deep and complicated things when it comes to understanding the mysteries of God, when it comes to understanding all the you're doing and what it looks like and how it operates. There's definitely complication and depth here, Lord. But for us, there is no need for confusion. There is no need for fear. There's no need for worry. Because everything that we need to know to understand who you are and what to believe is answered in the gospel. I ask that we would be rooted in the gospel, but that we would grow in the gospel as well. That you would grow us into the mysteries of understanding what it is that you would have us to know and how you work, but that we do it always through the simple idea that we can't, you can, and you have. Lord, for those who have not accepted that, I ask that they would get it today, that they would click with them for the first time today, and that they might trust in you to do what they cannot do for themselves. For the ones that are out there that are so afraid because they're trying their best and they're just failing, I ask that you would remind them that you do not expect them to succeed on their own. You knew they couldn't succeed on their own, which is the whole point of the gospel. And that you don't want them worried or afraid or sleepless over their sin, but you want them to trust you and the work you've already done and continue to do. For those of us who you've placed far along in our spiritual lives. You placed us so far along in our understanding and our ability and our strength. I ask that we would remember how we got there. That we wouldn't look down on others who aren't as far along or look down on others who aren't with us. That we would not apply a standard of merit to all the people around us when you apply a standard of grace to us. But that in our marriages, in our parenting, in our neighboring, in our workplaces, in our church, that we would apply the standard of the gospel always. I ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.